If you want to be more effective in your work and in your life, and you'd like to have more confidence that you're meeting your intentions, this is where it begins. Welcome to Do Busy Right, helping you organize your information and manage your attention so that they work for you, not against you. We educate you and encourage you by discussing ways to be more effective, not more exhausted. Let's do busy right. Hi there. This is another in the series of outcomes of the kind of coaching and the kind of systems I deliver. And I want you to know what those outcomes are because we need to talk about the challenges that you face in order to determine whether the solution's right for you. So the outcome I want to address here is eradicating information overload. And we all know what information overload is, and we'll get into it. But the goal of personal information management is to put processes and tools around our information so that we can manage it. Manage means control it, tame it, fewer emergencies around it. And our fear that we don't have it well managed causes us stress and anxiety, and we call this feeling information overload. So a feeling of information overload is an indication that we don't have our information managed well. After all, if you have a feeling of bill overload, you would look at your finances and budget, right? But is information overload a useful term? Does it help us understand and deal with the problem, or is it just a cute headline / clickbait? So I've developed best-in-class personal information management process and tool set. I call it the attention compass. The outcome: as you implement Attention Compass, you should feel less stress and anxiety about the amount of information you have to deal with. You should also be free of concerns about whether or not you have enough bandwidth. If you want to know more about this solution, reach out to me or hit dobusyright.com. As we look into information overload, I think the useful place to start is the definition of information. I always think that understanding the situation / enemy is a key to success. Now, if information overload and or the associated stress is a primary concern for you, this is your episode. So we'll start with a definition of information, and the bad news is we don't really have a good definition of information. And that's coming from an expert. Information is one of the primary things that my Ph.D. is about. What we do know is when we talk or write, we're conveying something. We're conveying a message. Now, the message is I'm going to say, semantic content of the sounds that we're putting together in spoken language. That message has content that means something. Now, our placeholder word for the something is information. Another way that this happens is we use a similar mechanism to record our thoughts. Something along the lines of writing communications to ourselves or storing information so that we can use it later. It's interesting to note as we're trying to define information, it's interesting to note that our writing is very, very much like our speaking, which is interesting in the broader sense of the definition of information. So whatever information is, it's contained or conveyed both in speech communication, oral communication, and in writing. And that's, again, largely because our writing is so very similar to our speech. So we think we can dimly grasp what information is. And I said we don't have a good definition of what information is, but it's related in some way to conveying some meaning. If you want to dig further down on the underlying theory of what information is, a guy named James Click Glesk, wrote a book called The Information. And it's probably 10 or 12 years old at this point, but it's really an effective examination of the emergence of information in our consciousness. And so that'll be a primary source for what I'm doing now, along with my own studies in PhD land. So one of the questions we talk about communication and messages and semantic content of a message. And we need to wonder really whether information is an independent thing. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, certainly messages can exist independently. A message can be stored, that is, written down or otherwise recorded electronically. But we can do that in a way that we really couldn't store conversation, and you sort of still can't store conversation in a way that you can store writing. I mean, we can record a conversation, but that doesn't have the same sense of permanency and organization that writing has. And I guess that would be the primary difference. I would suggest that writing is more like speech making than it is like conversation. It's more planned, it's less ad hoc, it's less fluid. But we get this stuff out there, this information out there, and we're trying to understand if the information is really an independent quantity or whatever. Now, we know that information and attention are very, very closely related. That's why around here I talk about attention management. Our attention is where our time and some information, maybe our information or some information, collide with each other. Because in order to pay attention, what we're paying attention to is trying to derive information from some source. And in some cases, it's easier than others. And again, the word information creeps in as if it is an independent thing. But we don't know that to be fact. In other words, we don't know the independence of information to be a fact as distinct from human consciousness. And it gets a little philosophical here, but by this point, you recognize that that's the way I roll anyway, so you must be comfortable with it. An example that may illustrate the challenge of the notion of information and attention. There are astronomical bodies that produce regular pulses of radiation that we can perceive, measure. Now, we can't see them. I mean, there are blinking stars, I believe, but this is more radio astronomy. And so there's a set of bodies that produce this. And it may be because of some rotation that's going on, or I don't recall what the purpose is. But that signal, if you will, is out there. And the philosophical question, unfortunately, this is like the sound in the forest, kind of question, but can information be said to be there if we don't have a human mind to observe it, to make meaning out of the information? Because what you can do with that kind of astronomical body is you can use it for nothing else. You can use it as a timer, and you can count the pulses. Now, that may be more or less accurate or more or less expensive than a clock or a watch, but it's possible. And so in that sense, clearly what's happening becomes information. These pulses, we turn them into information. But failing us observing, is that actually information in any real sense of the word? So that's a hypothetical question, and I don't bring that up to confuse you or bore you or distract you, but just to think, it's not terribly clear what that whole information thing is. And so we're going to have to really dissect it. And I don't want us to haul off and believe that we know what information is, because then we won't treat it with the respect that we need to treat it with. Now, we're painting with a broad brush here. In our culture, we refer to many things as information: newspapers, books, YouTube videos, movies. In part, that's because it's delivered over what we've come to call information technology, for reasons that are historical in nature and, quite frankly, don't make a ton of sense. Our technology is largely morphed over into communications technology. Now, do we store information and those sorts of things? Probably. But again, until we get a clear definition of what information is, then we're really not going to know, right? So, again, back to all of this definition of information. And again, I suggest it's not terribly clear. Now, okay, how does this murky definition of information then relate back to what we tend to call information overload? Well, my point here is I don't think we really mean information overload. And the primary reason I say that is because information itself is not something that interrupts us, that impinges on us. It's not something that intrudes on our attention or consciousness by itself. It simply can't do that. You've probably heard the story about, if you're trying to lose weight, put the fruit on the counter and the cookies in the cabinet. That way, when you go in there, you see the fruit and it claims your attention, at least briefly. And that makes you more likely to eat it rather than the cookies that you can't see. Now, it's really interesting that the cookies that are in the cabinet and we can't see them can still call out to us. And we can get into that more, and may refer to that again later. So information is not really impinging on us, but we do feel stress about something. And that stress, we say overload, meaning that we feel like there's more of something than we can deal with. And we feel like we're just scurrying and hectically trying to stay on top of it. Sisyphus is the Greek character who was doomed to roll the rock up the hill every day. And the next day he would find the rock at the bottom of the hill again. And we feel that way, running up of an increasingly large pile of sand, that we're all treadmill, we're all effort and not making any real progress here. And so, again, we're trying to drill down on what is it that we feel overloaded with so that we can clarify it and deal with it effectively. So another piece that comes into play in all this discussion is the notion of communication. Now, communication is also one of those words that's a little bit hard to define, particularly as we try to define it relative to information. Is a communication something that contains information or not? Claude Shannon is the father of information theory, but he presumed that information theory, information transmission, was independent of the content of the message. So he didn't deal with semantic content at all. He just dealt with information over the wire. So this is an open question. Okay, so we think about communication. Now, the interesting thing about communication is that it does get our attention. It's intended to get our attention. In the vast majority of cases, anyway, people communicate to us because they want our attention, and they want our attention on some, for lack of a better word, information that they're going to impart to us. Hey, there's a fire in the building. you need to know. And so communication does impinge on us. But, communication in and of itself is an interesting concept. So if we try and think about communication and break it down, then it's information typically that's used in a way that has a message, and that's the content of the communication. And it also usually has a signal. Now, typically when we talk about information, we don't distinguish between content and signal. But we may, without trying to define information, we can say, well, there's a signal that communication is underway, and then there's content of the communication. And the two may blend together. In other words, somebody may shout a fact at you. Well, it's really the shouting and the tone of voice that is the signal. And then the content of the semantic content of the sentence is the message. And the message is more like information than the signal itself. So, in the modern world, what's the challenge? Well, we get communicated at, we get shouted at all the time from a lot of different quarters of our world. There's so many communications being launched in our direction. And we begin to feel that as a claim on our attention. And as I said before, our attention is where information collides with time. So this makes us feel like our time is insufficient to deal with all the communication that we receive. And so that's where this sense of overload comes from, is, wow, there's lots of communication, right? Lots of communications being aimed at me. Okay. Now, the reason I don't say lots of information being aimed at me is because some communications contain information and some don't, and it depends on who you are. If I get a communication that is in a language I don't understand, then it can't be said to convey much in the way of information to me. Where if somebody that speaks that language receives it, then it can convey a wealth of information to them. And so this brings the observer of the information back in. So we're looking at this communication thing. So we've moved away from information. Now we're talking about communication. And we said communication is content and signal. So if we want to get back to kind of information overload, then we probably want to look at the content rather than the signal, because the content really is where the overwhelming majority of information, if there is some, is going to be contained in the message. And so now the question shifts from information overload to content overload, right? Are we trying to consume too much content from the communications that we get? So David Allen made this real pithy observation, and I'm not even sure he knew entirely what it meant, but it's one of those things that's very prophetic. He said that there's no such thing as information overload, because if there was, you'd go into a library and your brain would explode. And what he means by this, and we alluded to this a minute ago, content in itself has no means to claim our attention, to impinge on us. And when he talks about the library, I mean, just imagine if you were in the library and the books could holler at you and they weren't well organized, it would be a horror show of trying to find information. But in the library, the information is well managed and it doesn't shout at us. It doesn't impinge on our attention, typically. So there's the information there is well managed because we can find it when we need it. And it's a intentional process on our part to go collect what it is we feel like we need. So we can go there and we can find what we're looking for. So I highlight that because if we look at email, we can feel like our head's going to explode, Where if we go into a library, it's actually very peaceful and very calm and very quiet. And so using that difference to kind of tease out what our definition is and what our actual challenge is so that we can face it more clearly and with greater precision. So we go into a library and our head doesn't explode, and that's because the books can't, the information has no signal associated with it, really. And the information is also not jumbled up. It is, in fact, organized. And once we learn the organizational schema, we can find what we need. Right. On the other hand, and here's just a minor example. If we walk over to a display shelf in the library, I think of current fiction because they have them sitting out where you can see the cover, and the cover of a book is designed to get your attention. So it's designed to have, and I won't say signal because it doesn't come at you. You have to seek it out. So it's not shouting at you, but once you start looking at titles, then your attention is involved and engaged. And then the different covers start at least murmuring to you. Oh, this one's going to be good because it's got this typeface and this picture on the front. And that one's not going to be as good because it's different. And then we have to look at all these things and begin to process which one we want to pick. And so now we're beginning to feel a little bit of the stress of information overload. And it's because now we've allowed the books out of their orderly little shelves when all you can see is the spine and the title of the book, and that's if you choose to look at it, over into some presentation mode where it's more likely to claim our attention, and making that distinction so that we can see what we're really talking about here. So we see all the covers and titles and we begin to feel this stress. So this is the fact that the difference here, I think, is communication or signal. And then we begin to feel the early nudge of, wow, that's a lot of stuff. How am I ever going to pick a book? So I will say one more thing about the library metaphor. We talk about personal information management. And one of the better metaphors for personal information management is to have one's own personal library. Now, what we mean by that clearly is to have a store of information that behaves itself or is constructed similarly to the way a library behaves itself or is constructed. And that means that our information doesn't shout at us and it's organized according to some principle that helps us find it when we go there intentionally to acquire it, to acquire a message or a communication or some information. So that's one of the things that happens when we start doing Busy Right is we've built a library of our information that doesn't shout at us. It is available to us when we need to go, and our finding of information is made more efficient by structure, much like in a library of books. We begin to manage that information. So we've talked about information, we've talked about communication, we've talked about communication content. Now, the final candidate when we talk about communication is signal. And so we begin to think about signal overload. Now, what do we know about signals as relates to communication? Well, the amount of incoming signal has never been so high. And we have the feeling that we're not equal to the task. Again, that's this overload, right? So we need to think about the signal component of communication and see if that's a useful concept for us. Now, you can convey information, you can convey messages. The distinction between signal and message is not terribly clear. So and it smears over in the very definition of information. Now, if we're using signal to deliver information, then one of the distinguishing features is that signal cannot, by its very nature, carry a lot of information. That's message. So we think in these ways. Paul Revere's one if by land and two if by sea. That turns out to be a binary signal. They had agreed that it would be one candle or two candles, one lamp or two lamps. And they had agreed in advance what that signal would mean. And in that way, the signal information is infused into the signal. And usually, in order for information to be present in a signal, there has to be some variation of state. If you hear an explosion, the actual content that has been delivered to you is quite low. Something happened. If instead of one if by land and two if by sea, it had been, an explosion if by land and silence if by sea, then any explosion would have caused the receiver, our Paul Revere, to assume that there was content happening and that he could begin his ride, when in point of fact, maybe not. So signal can contain information, and that was a little bit of an aside, and I hope you don't mind. Signal can include information, but it has to be prearranged, pre-organized. Even if we write a letter, it has to be pre-organized that we both understand English. And the signal about a letter is you get a package of paper in your mailbox, which is very different from the content of the letter. You've got a packet of paper in your mailbox that may contain 1 page or 10 pages. It may be from an admirer, or it may be from the IRS. It might be a bonus from your boss, or it might be a bill collector. So again, this signal is very low bandwidth. Bandwidth meaning the information content. And as such, the signal piece itself is simply there to arouse our attention. It's there to impinge on our attention, and very seldom is it prearranged that we have content in the signal itself. But if so, then that has to be predefined between the sender and the receiver. So we talked about Paul Revere. Another example is streetlights, stoplights. There's nothing built into red, yellow, and green that should mean stop, caution, and go in any particular sense. It's a social convention. So we've all prearranged and we all understand what these signals mean. And somebody who doesn't understand that green means go is going to be completely confused. You can't derive green means go. You could derive it from the behavior of other cars around you. So in any event, we have these signals in the world, and we send signals and create signals, and we also allow signals to happen to us. We can, in almost every instance, control the signal. We're in a world where phones ring, computers beep, screens flash, windows pop up, but we're not hopeless victims to those signals. We can almost always control them. Now, some episodes ago, in a less, let's say, rigorously scientific episode, I talked about the fact that information overload can be thought of simply as a filter problem. And I think it was Clay Shirky that talked about that. And the challenge of that definition is that in order to filter information, we've got to give it attention and understand what it means. Okay. And thus, we can still be overloaded. Now, we think in our world we've been taught or conditioned, or our culture has made us believe that the way to deal with life is to set up and amplify these signals that are associated with communication. And I think in many cases that's true. In many cases, a signal is useful to us because otherwise, if your phone didn't ring, then you'd have to have it constantly attached to your ear and wait for somebody to come on and say, "Hey, Larry, I need to talk to you." And then you can say, "Hey, I'm here." Okay, so signals are important, but signals are also vastly overused, in my opinion. People signal to you for their purposes, not for your own. Now, some of those people are very important and some of them are not. And the challenge here with signal, and I'm getting around to the solution, is we don't have to amplify those signals. In fact, we can turn down the volume on those signals if we choose to. And one of our primary concerns is if we turn down the signal volume, so to speak, then we'll miss out on important information. But it's not a binary thing. We have tools at our disposal that will help us set up these filters. And it's just a question really of taking the time and having the initiative to manage those filters. And that's what Clay Shirky was talking about. We need to maintain some sense of, maybe security is the right word, around our information, and not you don't let just anybody walk into your home and talk to you. You don't let just anybody into your computer network and start looking at your data. So there's no reason to suppose that we need to let just anybody give us information. And thus, we need to be very careful about what signals we allow to come through our filters and what signals that we don't. So we drill down then to, well, information really has no way to impinge on us, so we can't be dealing with information overload. Message is primarily information and is the larger part of a communication. But again, that's the informational content. So we've kind of drilled down to the fact that when we say information overload, what we probably actually mean is signal overload. And that's very good news because signal is in fact something that we control. If you think back to the radio pulse astronomy example I gave, we don't control whether or not that astronomical body gives off those pulses. But we do control whether or not we set up an antenna and amplify that to where it becomes a signal. And there might be good reasons to do that, but we don't amplify every signal. So we've got plenty of technology that will help us selectively amplify certain signals and selectively turn down, I don't know the opposite of amplify, de-amplify, the signals that are normally less important to us. Now, how we determine a signal is important or not is a whole nother question. The signal itself is typically not important. It's the content of the communication that the signal indicates that's usually the important part. So we try to substitute the signal for the importance. The signal needs to be a stand-in for the importance of the communication. So now we talk about filtering on this signal stuff, and it's not terribly challenging to do. It just takes some time and some effort. I mean, filtering incoming signal is what your spam filter does. It even is called a filter for your convenience in understanding what it does. We then have certain signals and we take the properties of the signal. So if you look at email and we say, okay, well, what are the properties of the signal about an email? Well, in some sense, the arrival of an email can produce a signal. That's in our control, and we handle that through notifications on our computer. But we also know a good bit of information that is, shall we say, written on the envelope of the communication. Same thing we do with regular mail. It comes in an envelope with a stamp, and you look at the envelope to determine at some level how you use it to filter and determine the likelihood of the content of the message being important to you and thus worth giving your attention to and consuming. So we've worked through some ideas, and I think we've gotten to the point where we've got terminology around it that makes our thinking more precise. So all of these ideas work together and they make our attention management this challenging thing. So we talked about it's not really information overload, it's not communication overload, it's signal overload. So now, what do we do about it? Well, I, of course, have, what would we say, signaled the outcome. But what we do is we build filters because we can always ignore all communication, but something in us doesn't like that solution. We certainly don't want to shut down all incoming. We wouldn't be very good friends, spouses, parents, children, pet owners if we shut down all incoming signal. But we do have significant technology at our disposal that will help us. And that's what a filter is a selective sense of letting some things through and keeping others out. Or the other way around, depending on how you use the filter. So now that we understand that, personal information management then becomes, it starts to include this concept of signal and communication management. So in order to manage our personal information, we also need to manage the signal because of all this communication coming at us, coming towards us. And it's really, and I hope I've convinced you here, it's really just a question of tactics, of paying the right attention in the right place at the right time. And that helps us overcome this feeling of overload or overwhelm. Now, our problem, when you really boil it down, the fundamental problem that we've got here is that the actionable information we receive is completely smothered by the information we receive that's not actionable. And this is with communication aimed at us, but it's also with information that we seek out. And again, this is this selectivity piece that we owe to ourselves. It's a filter question. How do we selectively allow our attention to be diverted, impinged on with the incoming communications. So we set up that technology. So we don't automatically let the information holler at us. We use tech to filter out the signals. For example, if you are active in voice calls on your mobile phone, you can filter the signal by sender. And I do this, and it does take some time. I do this, and my phone is typically set on do not disturb. And then I have my favorites list, and I turned on the setting that says, hey, if they're in my favorites list, then bypass the do not disturb function and let my phone ring. Well, that's not a set it and forget it process, as it turns out. From time to time, I will, for example, call a plumber. Well, if and if the plumber is not on my past do not disturb list, if they're not on the call through list, then I'm not going to get their return call when I leave my message. Of course, they seldom answer the phone directly, but so I call out and I have to add them to my favorites list so that when they call back, they will ring to me versus going straight to voicemail and I never hear them. So I want some fine-grained control over this signal filtering. Of course, my kids are always on the favorites list because they always need to be able to ring my phone, and that's fine. So building these things and maintaining them is a cost that we have to pay. And the reward for paying that cost is that we don't have information overload. Or as we, I think, can come to call it here in our little group, we can call it signal overload. Now, the other piece of all this, the other segment, if you will, of information overload is that we are, at some level, we're hoarders of information. So this is not about the communication side anymore. This is just about information that we have paid enough attention to decide we need to keep. Or should we be in some sort of a research project where we go out and actually try to acquire certain kinds of information? Lots of information out there. So how do we sort through and reasonably quickly find the information we want? And I'll give you an example of this kind of information overload. I read lots of books, and I have 75 books that are continuous reference books for me. And the ideas in those books are important enough that I tend to go back to them. An example of such a book is Thinking in Bets by Annie Duke. I refer to it a lot because I think it's just that useful to us as we try to understand what we're doing in the world. Nevertheless, if I want to bring out a fact or a quote from one of these, say, 75 books, and there's no organizational scheme to the, what would we say, 75 books, say 150,000 words? Or is it 1.5 million? Public math. Anyway, large number of words. If I have to go through and look at every book and flip pages in every book, then my search for information is going to be overloaded by the amount of information I need to search. The notion of a search space shows up here. And so the speed with which you can find information, or the speed with which you can find something you're searching for, let me put it that way, is inversely proportional to the size of your search space. Meaning, if you've lost your car keys and you know that they're in one of three places, then you can find them relatively quickly. If you have no idea where the car keys are, then you might have to get your spouse to drive you around town to all the different places that you were since the last time you used your car. So, search space. Well, the whole notion of organization is to give us opportunities to limit our search space. And how do we do that? Well, one way is by having pointers to information. And this is what we mean by well-organized information library. Our personal information space needs to be well organized such that we can narrow down the search space. And that's how search space works. Okay, so if I've got 1,000 emails, then I've got to search through 1,000 emails. I don't know anything about them. If I recall who sent the email of interest, then I can shrink my search space by filtering. Okay, so now we see how the two concepts relate to each other. In fact, come to think of it, there may be the notion of response space when we're looking at communication. We'll see. But when we say search space, that means information that we've recorded or information that's otherwise available to us. We need to shrink down that search space. This is the huge value that Google has provided us and why they're such a wealthy company, because we pay them handsomely for the services that they provide. They narrow the search space for us. So we don't have to search everything possible. They do it on our behalf. And they return a minuscule subset of all the information that's available on a topic. And so then we can human search, right? So computers are very efficient at search. As it turns out, we didn't think this was true 20 years ago. But computers are very efficient at search, and they can help us narrow our search space and thus help us manage information. So again, if it's your own information store, then it needs to be organized well. And going back to my bookshelf example, one of the ways I do this is I create my own indexes for books. And when I find an idea in a book that's important, I note the page number and I make some note about some summary of the information that's there. And then this is either in a sheet or two of paper that's inserted into the book, or it's on the blank pages at the back of the book. And thus, instead of having to flip through the book, trying to find information that's important to me, I've got my own index. And so I can usually narrow it down to some set of books and then flip through the index that I've created in order to find that information that's important. So that was a little bit of an aside, but it's that other piece of filtering. And so it's critical when we deal with both the communication side of information and the storage side of information that we maintain and build filters. And that's simply strong organization in both cases. So, information overload. I think we've dealt with the idea that it's not the information in and of itself that feels like overload to us, but it's the communication, and even more precisely, it's the amount of signal. It's the number of people that we allow to shout at us. And the technology is well within our grasp for us to limit the number of people that can shout at us. Certainly, we also have the technology to limit the number of people whose communications we inspect. And that's the different kind. That's the what? If you listen to podcasts like this, do you listen to all the available podcasts? No, you don't. So you limit that income. I'm glad I passed your filter. So the way to deal with overload is to build filters, and we've certainly got the technology for that on both sides, both the signal side, which is communication that attempts to impinge on us, but also on the information store side, where this is information that we can organize and deal with in more efficient ways. So we've learned a lot from digging down into these definitional matters. And we've learned a lot about how to build filters. So build signal filters in your world and invest the time in the technology, learning to use the technology that allows us to do that filtering. I think it will pay back for you in minimizing the amount of information overload that you feel. Certainly, I have developed attention compass, and this is included out of the box. We build filters for the information that we need to deal with. So if that's something you'd like some help with, you certainly know how to reach out to me, and I'll put some contact information in the show notes. I'll leave it there for now. This is Larry Tribble, Ph.D. Thanks for taking some time to improve your task and information management on the Do Busy Right podcast. The show is dedicated to helping you think about how to get better at working. And we do this by improving your attention and your focus. I believe that your work is not just about your job, but about all the tasks that you do to turn yourself, your environment, and your relationships into what you want them to be. What we're really talking about here is the underpinnings of becoming who you want to be. The primary way I help people is through coaching the attention compass process. Attention compass is 4 workflows and a tool set that support our information, task, and attention management. I help people with big goals to build habits that put them in a position to achieve. We do this by eliminating wasted time and wasted attention. If you'd like to know more, you can find me on LinkedIn or go to dobusyright.com for more information. Have a good week, more effective and less exhausted. Do Busy Right.